He built an empire in Manhattan, but he never imagined the greatest revelation of his life wouldn't come from skyscrapers, but from inside his own house, on the night he came home early. The morning light in Manhattan filtered through the towering glass facade of the Midtown skyscraper where Andrew Harris kept his empire alive. The city stirred with its familiar rhythm, yellow cabs pushing through clogged intersections, traders clutching coffee cups like lifelines, assistants already glued to their phones. Andrew's office on the 47th floor was immaculate, silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning and the constant vibration of his phone. He wore the uniform of his domain, a dark tailored suit, a tie that spoke of subtle power, and an expression carved by years of late nights, negotiations, and victories that tasted more like relief than joy. He had been awake since 5. Sleep, for Andrew, had become a luxury he purchased in fragments, not a natural gift. There was always another chart to review, another investor to appease, another deal threatening to unravel. His desk was an altar of control, monitors glowing with global markets, reports stacked in disciplined order, and a single framed photograph pushed to the side. It showed Caroline smiling under a wide summer hat, Mason in her lap holding a toy plane, his small legs hidden under a blanket. Andrew's own smile in the photo looked stiff, almost rehearsed, as though he had been thinking about a call he needed to take rather than the moment itself. By the time the office clock hit 8, he was already on his third meeting. His assistants orbited like satellites, carrying schedules, whispering updates, adjusting his life with invisible strings. He nodded, responded, asked incisive questions, and made decisions that shifted millions of dollars in seconds. And yet, beneath it all, a heaviness pressed against him. He rarely named it, but it lingered in the quiet between calls, in the sterile silence of his office after everyone left. He told himself it was simply fatigue. In Greenwich, an hour away, the house that was more like a manor stood in stark contrast to the energy of Midtown. At 900 square meters, with tall white columns and sprawling windows, it appeared pristine from the street. Behind its perfect exterior, mornings were less polished. Caroline moved through wide hallways with a mug of coffee, her hair tied back loosely, her phone buzzing with reminders from school, appointments, and dinner plans. She managed the house with invisible labor, coordinating staff, ensuring Mason's therapy was logged, fielding messages from friends who measured their worth in designer handbags and the exclusivity of charity galas. Mason, at 4, was already awake and sitting at the kitchen island, a bowl of cereal in front of him. His blonde hair caught the sunlight spilling through the tall windows, and the purple crutches leaned against the stool where he perched. Caroline bent down, adjusted the hem of his shirt, kissed the crown of his head, and placed slices of banana in his bowl. "Mom, where's Lucy?" Mason asked, his voice still carrying the softness of early childhood. "She's upstairs changing the sheets." "She'll be down soon," Caroline answered, offering a smile she hoped looked effortless. Lucy Alvarez was more than a housekeeper in this home. She had been hired 2 years earlier, originally to manage cleaning and laundry. But she had quietly assumed a greater role, especially with Mason. Having cared for her younger brother with similar motor challenges, she carried within her a knowledge that had not been learned from books but from years of necessity. She had an instinct for Mason's needs, the way to encourage him without overwhelming, how to turn an ordinary morning into a training opportunity, how to spark a smile from a boy who carried frustration too heavy for his age. By late morning, the house settled into its quiet rhythm. Caroline scrolled through messages from Sylvia Price, her friend from town who prided herself on her exclusive circle. Sylvia's notes were always sprinkled with subtle judgments disguised as gossip, and Caroline absorbed them with a mix of irritation and reluctant amusement. Meanwhile, Andrew's day unfolded in a blur of calls, presentations, and negotiations. The clock seemed to leap forward without mercy. Lunch came and went as a forgotten plate on his desk. By evening, as the Manhattan skyline lit up with neon and office windows glowed like stars, he prepared for one final investor meeting. He had expected it to stretch into the night, another reason to return home past 9, when the house was already still and Mason already asleep. But the unexpected happened. The meeting ended at 6:20. The investors, usually insatiable, were satisfied quickly. Andrew looked at his phone. His driver was waiting. For a moment, he considered staying, catching up on emails, reviewing reports, pushing forward as always. Yet an unfamiliar thought slid into his mind. What if he went home now? No one was expecting him. There was no dinner plan, no staged welcome. Just the house as it was, at an hour he had not seen it in years. The car ride north blurred past. The familiar landmarks, the expanse of the FDR Drive, the dark stretch over the river, the green highways, were seen but not registered. Andrew's thoughts drifted. He wondered if Mason was still awake. He tried to recall the last time he had seen his son smile genuinely. The memory failed him, and the realization settled with a weight he could not name. When the car turned onto the tree-lined street, the house rose in the twilight, its windows glowing warmly. He stepped out, the sound of gravel crunching under polished shoes, and approached the front door. For the first time in years, he felt the flicker of uncertainty. The door opened with the familiar creak, and the air of home, clean wood, faint citrus from polished floors, a trace of dinner, welcomed him. But what he saw rooted him in place. In the vast living room, illuminated by a chandelier and the fading glow of sunset, Lucy knelt on the rug, wiping spilled juice with a cloth. Beside her, Mason stood, leaning slightly on his purple crutches, a grin stretching across his face. He bent awkwardly, offering napkins from a small pile to help her. His cheeks flushed with effort, but his eyes sparkled. Andrew froze. The image struck him with more force than any market crash or sudden gain ever had. Mason, upright, helping, smiling. It was a sight so alien that Andrew's breath caught in his throat. "Daddy." Mason's voice lifted, bright and triumphant. "Look, I can stand." Andrew stepped forward, his eyes darting between Lucy and his son, searching for an explanation, for assurance this was real and not a cruel trick of light or fatigue. Mason straightened, proud, balancing, his legs trembling yet determined. "I can stay like this for 5 minutes now," Mason announced, his tone a mixture of pride and challenge, as though daring his father to believe him. "Lucy helps me every morning. We train in the garden before school. Every day." The words sank deep. Andrew's gaze shifted to Lucy, who looked up from the rug, her hands still holding the cloth, her dark hair falling slightly across her face. She seemed caught between guilt and defiance, as though unsure how he would respond. "We do it before his online classes," she said quietly, rising to her feet. "Sometimes during my lunch, sometimes after. I never charge extra. I just know a few exercises." "My brother." Her voice trailed, but the implication was clear. Andrew's chest tightened. He looked again at Mason, who gripped the crutches, his face lit with joy Andrew had almost forgotten existed. For years, Andrew had told himself Mason's condition was permanent, that his presence would change nothing. Yet here, in his own home, change had been happening quietly without him. He wanted to speak, to ask questions, to scold, or to thank. But the words tangled in his throat. At last, he cleared it and said softly, "That's enough for today, Mason. Time for bed." His tone was firmer than he intended. Mason's smile faltered, but he obeyed, moving slowly toward the hallway with Lucy following to help. Alone for a moment in the vast room, Andrew stood still. The house no longer felt silent. It pulsed with something he could not yet name. He realized the routine he had crafted so meticulously had already been ruptured. And it had not been by a market swing or a hostile takeover. It had been by his son's smile. The night pressed softly against the windows of the Harris home, and Andrew walked through the silent hallways as if entering a foreign country. He heard faint laughter from Mason's room, Lucy's voice coaxing him through his bedtime routine. Caroline was in her study, a small room off the main hall filled with stacks of magazines, photo frames, and a desk cluttered with notebooks she never seemed to finish. She looked up when Andrew entered, surprise flickering across her face. "You're home early." Her tone was neither sharp nor warm, merely astonished. Early, for Andrew, meant anything before 10. "Investors finished sooner than expected," he replied, loosening his tie. He hesitated, then added, "I saw Mason." Caroline closed her notebook slowly, her fingers lingering on its cover. "You did." "He was standing with Lucy. He said he trains every morning." The words felt awkward in his mouth, like truths he hadn't prepared to speak. Caroline studied him with a calmness he envied. She had always been better at absorbing life without appearing rattled. I didn't tell you because I knew what you'd say, that it wasn't safe. That Lucy's job description doesn't include therapy. But Andrew, he smiles again. He believes in himself again. What was I supposed to do? Stop it. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration tangled with a dawning guilt he didn't want to confront. It should have been me. I should have been the one helping him. You can't be two people at once, Caroline said softly, her eyes narrowing not with anger, but with fatigue. You chose to be the man in Manhattan. I chose to be here. That's how we've survived. The words cut deeper than she intended. He looked away, unable to argue. Later, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, memories pressed in. He remembered the hospital room 4 years earlier. Caroline holding Mason swaddled in blue. The doctor's quiet explanations about congenital limitations, the uncertainty of progress. Andrew had felt himself detach, as if the words were for someone else. Work had become a shield, numbers and markets more manageable than fragile bones and developmental charts. He told himself he was providing, but in the quiet honesty of the night, he wondered if he had simply run. Down the hall, Mason drifted into sleep with Lucy reading a story at his bedside. Her presence in this house was unassuming yet indispensable, weaving herself into spaces Andrew had neglected. She closed the book gently, tucked the blanket around Mason, and lingered for a moment watching his chest rise and fall. She thought of her brother, still in the small apartment in Queens, and how his laughter had sounded the first time he'd taken 3 steps unaided. She remembered her mother's tears. The Harris household was larger, wealthier, but the emotions, the fight for hope, were the same. When Andrew finally fell asleep, the image of Mason standing, crutches trembling under small arms, stayed vivid. It unsettled him in ways no market downer never had. Morning arrived crisp and pale, the sun cutting across the manicured lawn like a blade of gold. Andrew was awake before dawn, restless. He canceled 3 meetings on his calendar with a single message to his assistant, personal commitment. Reschedule. The words looked foreign on his phone screen. At 7:50, he stood by the wide kitchen windows, coffee cooling in his hand, waiting. Caroline entered in her robe, stopping short when she saw him. You're here. I said I'd watch, he replied simply. The back garden stretched like a private park, the grass still jeweled with dew. At 8, Lucy and Mason appeared at the sliding doors. Mason wore sneakers and a determined look, his crutches under his arms. Lucy carried a small mat, setting it on the lawn. Morning, Mr. Harris, she said carefully, her tone neutral but respectful. Andrew nodded. Let's see. Mason grinned, eyes darting nervously between his father and Lucy. Watch me, Dad. He positioned himself upright, gripping the crutches. His little body swayed, but he steadied. 30 seconds passed, then 40. His breathing quickened, cheeks flushed. At last, he wobbled and sat down on the mat, laughing breathlessly. 38 seconds, Lucy announced gently. That's progress. Yesterday was 32. Andrew swallowed against the lump in his throat. Good job, Mason. Really good. The boy's eyes shone with something Andrew hadn't seen directed at him in a long time. Pride seeking approval. You mean it? Yes, Andrew said, kneeling down so he was eye level with his son. I mean it. The moment stretched, fragile and luminous. Caroline, watching from the doorway, pressed her hand to her lips. After practice, Mason bounded toward the kitchen, hungry for pancakes. Lucy lingered behind, rolling up the mat. Andrew approached her, voice low. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't think it was my place, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Caroline allowed it. Mason wanted it. That was enough for me. You should have, he said, though the edge in his tone softened as he looked back toward his son's laughter echoing inside. But, thank you. Lucy gave a small nod, unsure whether to accept his gratitude. That evening, as twilight deepened over Greenwich, Andrew sat with Caroline on the terrace. The conversation unfolded haltingly at first, then with raw honesty. She admitted the loneliness, the dinners attended alone, the subtle resentment she harbored. He admitted the fear that if he invested himself in Mason's struggle, he wouldn't be strong enough to face the outcome. In the silence that followed, cicadas buzzing faintly in the trees, Andrew made a decision. Tomorrow morning, I'll be out there again. Caroline turned to him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and tentative hope. Are you serious? Yes. It's time, he said. No more excuses. The next morning, he would join them on the lawn, no longer a spectator but a participant. And the quiet rupture of his carefully controlled life would begin its full unraveling. The following morning carried the crisp bite of autumn. A faint mist hovered over the lawn, and the garden smelled of damp earth and clipped hedges. Andrew stood at the edge of the grass, his shoes wet with dew. This was not Midtown. There was no boardroom table to shield him, no assistants arranging the day's strategy. Just Mason with his crutches and Lucy kneeling by the mat, encouraging him gently. Mason looked over and grinned nervously. "You're really here?" Andrew crouched down, loosening his tie as if shedding part of his armor. "I said I would be. Now let's see what you've got." The boy steadied himself. His small arms trembled as he pushed against the crutches. For 30 seconds, his eyes stayed fixed on Andrew's. At 45 seconds, sweat dotted his forehead. By the 1-minute mark, his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the mat with a breathless laugh. 1 minute and 2 seconds, Lucy said, her voice calm but bright. "That's a new record." Andrew knelt, placing a hand on Mason's shoulder. "That's incredible. I'm proud of you." The words surprised him as much as they did his son. Mason's face lit with an expression Andrew hadn't seen before, unfiltered joy directed at him. Caroline, watching from the terrace with her coffee, felt her throat tighten. Breakfast became ritual that day. Caroline made pancakes, a tradition she had once kept for Mason alone, and Andrew joined them at the table. Mason recounted his small victories between bites, while Andrew listened with a patience he rarely displayed in his office. By mid-morning, Andrew's phone buzzed incessantly with missed calls and emails, but he ignored them. He told himself it was only for one day. Yet when the sun dipped westward and the house fell into its usual hush, he already knew he would cancel another morning meeting. That evening, Andrew received a message from Sylvia Price. She and her husband were hosting a dinner party on Saturday. Just the right people, as she phrased it. Caroline mentioned it reluctantly, her voice tinged with apology. "I told her we'd think about it," she said. Andrew exhaled. "Do you want to go?" "Not really," Caroline admitted. "But refusing her always has consequences. She's relentless." He almost laughed. Markets bowed to his calculations, yet social politics in Greenwich remained foreign territory. Still, he agreed. They would go, for Caroline's sake, if nothing else. The next morning, Andrew appeared on the lawn again. Mason stood longer, balanced straighter. By the end of the week, he managed 5 steps, Lucy counting softly beside him. Andrew clapped instinctively, and Mason's grin widened until his cheeks hurt. It was a redefinition of victory. Not millions earned overnight, but steps counted, breaths held, seconds stretched into triumph. Andrew found himself hungrier for this than any quarterly gain. Saturday evening arrived wrapped in autumn chill, the kind that carried wood smoke from neighboring houses. Caroline dressed in a silk gown of muted green, her hair arranged with care. Andrew wore his usual tailored suit, though he felt strangely exposed, as though the armor no longer fit quite right. The Price residence was all gleaming marble and chandeliers meant to be noticed. Sylvia greeted them with the brightness of a woman who measured affection and status. Her eyes lingered on Andrew a moment too long, as if evaluating him not as a guest, but as a commodity. "Caroline, darling, you look divine," Sylvia cooed before turning to Andrew. "And you? So rare to see you outside the city." Dinner unfolded with practiced elegance. Lobster bisque, roasted lamb, wine selected for its pedigree rather than taste. The table buzzed with talk of hedge funds, private schools, and the coming charity gala. Andrew listened politely, though his mind kept drifting back to Mason's determined face on the lawn that morning. Then Sylvia's attention turned to Lucy, who had accompanied them only because Caroline insisted Mason needed her close. Lucy sat quietly at the far end of the table, in a modest dress, her posture respectful but firm. "And who is this?" Sylvia asked, her tone sugar-laced with steel. "This is Lucy Alvarez," Caroline replied evenly. "She helps us with Mason." Sylvia's smile tightened. "Ah, the help. How admirable. But surely there are specialists for such matters?" The words landed like shards of glass. Lucy's cheeks flushed, but she kept her eyes down. Mason, sitting beside her, looked up sharply. "Lucy's not just help. She makes me strong. She makes me walk." A silence spread around the table. Andrew's jaw clenched. He reached for his son's shoulder, steadying him, then turned his gaze to Sylvia. Lucy is part of our family. We don't use that word here. The air chilled despite the warmth of the chandeliers. Sylvia forced a brittle laugh, brushing the moment aside, but the fracture lingered. Later, as they drove home, Caroline exhaled deeply. "Thank you for saying that," she murmured. Andrew's voice was quiet, but resolute. It wasn't for her. It was for Mason. And for Lucy. That night, as Mason slept, Andrew lingered in the hallway outside his room. He realized something unsettling. Lucy had not only given his son strength, but had forced Andrew himself to redefine what mattered. And though rivals in his world might fight for deals and dominance, here in this house, the true battle had already begun. The rhythm of mornings in Greenwich shifted subtly, yet irrevocably. By now, Andrew was not simply a spectator but a participant. He rose earlier, sometimes before dawn, and walked down to the kitchen with the unfamiliar satisfaction of anticipation. Mason was waiting, crutches leaning nearby, his eager smile a beacon Andrew had not realized he craved. Lucy prepared the mat, her movements efficient but careful, always encouraging without demanding. Day by day, Mason's progress became tangible. A week after Andrew first joined them, Mason stood without wobbling for a full minute and 10 seconds. 2 weeks later, he managed 5 consecutive steps, Lucy guiding his balance with feather-light touches. Each milestone seemed small to the outside world, but monumental within the walls of the Harris estate. Andrew clapped. Caroline sometimes cried quietly from the terrace, and Mason glowed with pride. One morning, after Mason managed 6 steps, Andrew knelt in front of him. "You're unstoppable," he whispered, pride swelling in his chest. Mason's cheeks flushed, but his gaze hardened with seriousness uncommon for his age. "You're my dad, not my friend," he said suddenly. The words cut deep, sharper than any market betrayal. Andrew blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Mason shifted his crutches, his expression resolute. "I have friends, but I only have one dad, and I need you to be that. Not just sometimes. Always." Andrew's throat tightened. In boardrooms, he was a man of control, but here he had no defense. He reached out, pulling Mason into his arms, crutches clattering softly onto the grass. "I'm here," he whispered fiercely. "I promise I'm here." Lucy looked away respectfully, yet her chest ached with the weight of the moment. She had seen children crave attention before, but Mason's plea carried something deeper, the need for identity through his father's love. That evening, Andrew called Lucy into his study. She entered hesitantly, the grand shelves and leather chairs dwarfing her presence. He gestured toward a seat. "Sit, please." She sat carefully, folding her hands in her lap. "I owe you more than I can say," Andrew began. His voice carried none of the brisk efficiency he used at work. "You've done more for my son in a year than I managed in 4. And I realize I've been blind to that." Lucy lowered her eyes. "Mason is easy to believe in. He wants it badly. I just know what works. From my brother." Andrew nodded. "All the more reason. From now on, you won't just be our housekeeper. You'll be Mason's therapeutic companion, officially. I'll hire another staff member for the house. And I want to pay for your education. If you choose physiotherapy, I'll cover tuition, books, transport, everything. No conditions." Lucy's eyes widened, shock chasing across her face. "Mr. Harris, that's too much." "I don't." "It's not charity," Andrew interrupted firmly. "It's investment. In you. In Mason. In the future. You've proven your value. Now I want to make sure you have what you need." Tears pricked Lucy's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Andrew replied quietly. After a long silence, Lucy nodded. "Yes." When Caroline learned of the decision, she was stunned but relieved. "You're serious about this?" she asked. "Dead serious," Andrew said. "It's time I put resources where they matter most. Not just markets. Not just numbers. Family." For the first time in years, Caroline allowed herself to lean against him, her head on his shoulder, and believe that change was possible. Autumn deepened, leaves painting the streets of Greenwich in amber and crimson. Mason's progress continued steadily. By mid-November, he could walk 8 steps before collapsing into Andrew's arms, laughing breathlessly. The victories accumulated not just in movement, but in spirit. His laughter came more easily, his confidence grew. But outside the Harris home, not everyone celebrated these changes. At the local cafe one morning, Caroline met Sylvia for coffee. Sylvia wasted no time. So, the rumors are true. You've promoted your maid into some kind of therapist? Caroline, really? What will people think? Caroline set her cup down with deliberate calm. People will think whatever they want. My son is walking because of her. That's all that matters. Sylvia scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. There are proper professionals for that sort of thing. You can't blur the lines between staff and family. It's inappropriate. Caroline's patience snapped. What's inappropriate is pretending to care while sneering at someone who's given my child hope. Lucy is more family than half the people at your dinner parties. Sylvia leaned back, lips pursed, but said nothing. That evening, Andrew joined Mason and Lucy in the garden once more. Mason walked 7 steps before falling. Andrew caught him, lifting him high into the air, both of them laughing. Caroline watched from the terrace, her heart tugging with a mixture of joy and fear. Fear that this fragile balance might shatter under external judgment. Later, Andrew and Caroline sat together in the living room. She recounted Sylvia's words, her voice laced with anger. Andrew's jaw tightened. Then we don't need Sylvia, or her dinners, or her approval. From now on, no one disrespects Lucy in this house. Not in front of Mason. Not ever. Caroline studied him, surprised by the firmness in his tone. You've changed, she whispered. Maybe, he admitted. Or maybe I'm finally waking up. But the tests of loyalty were only beginning. Word spread quickly in Greenwich circles, and before long Ethan Gardner, Andrew's long-standing rival in both finance and influence, made his move. One afternoon, while Lucy pushed Mason in his stroller toward the park, a black car pulled up beside them. Ethan stepped out, dressed impeccably, his smile practiced. Miss Alvarez, isn't it? He said smoothly. I've heard remarkable things. I'd like to make you an offer. Double what Andrew Harris pays. A new car. Full health insurance for you and your family. You'd have opportunities beyond scrubbing floors. Lucy froze, Mason staring wide-eyed beside her. Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice. Think about your brother. Think about your mother. Don't waste your potential tied to the Harrises. He left a card in her hand before sliding back into the car, which purred away down the street. Lucy stood trembling, Mason clutching her hand. Are you leaving us? He asked, fear creeping into his small voice. Lucy knelt, pulling him close. No, Mason. I'm not leaving. I just have to think. Her heart raced with conflict. The offer promised stability her family desperately needed. But it also meant betraying the trust she had built here. That night, she lay awake, the card burning like a weight in her pocket, knowing a decision loomed that could reshape all their lives. The card remained in Lucy's bedside drawer, buried under folded sweaters, yet it seemed to radiate through the wood. Each time she walked past, she felt its weight. Ethan's voice lingered in her mind. Think about your brother. Think about your mother. He had targeted the part of her that never stopped aching. Her mother's health bills piled on the kitchen counter of their Queens apartment. Her younger brother needed new braces, new sessions with a specialist. Lucy sent money whenever she could, but her salary barely stretched. Ethan's offer would solve everything in an instant. She could be the provider her family deserved. And yet, each morning, when Mason looked up at her with trust in his wide eyes, the thought of leaving felt like betrayal. The Harris family had flaws, but they had given her more respect than she had ever known. Andrew's promise of education was not just financial support, it was belief. Belief in her worth. One morning, Mason managed 8 steps before stumbling into Andrew's arms. He laughed breathlessly, joy uncontainable. Did you see that, Lucy? 8. I saw a champ, she said, clapping. You're unstoppable. Andrew turned to her, pride softening his features. This is your doing. He's walking because of you. Lucy felt tears sting, but forced a smile. She couldn't tell him about Ethan's offer. Not yet. But secrets rarely stay hidden. That Saturday, Sylvia appeared uninvited at the Harris home. Caroline found her standing at the door, draped in a fur coat, her expression icy. Caroline, darling, Sylvia began, her voice dripping with mock concern. I thought you should know. Your little helper has been spotted speaking with Ethan Gardner. And rumor has it he's planning to snatch her away. Imagine the scandal. Caroline's jaw tightened. Thank you for your concern. But Lucy's loyalty is not for sale. Sylvia smirked. We'll see. Caroline closed the door firmly, her hands trembling. That evening, she confronted Lucy gently. Is it true? Did Ethan approach you? Lucy's face paled. Yes, but I didn't accept. I never would without telling you first. I didn't know how to handle it. Andrew entered midway, hearing enough to understand. His expression darkened. What did he offer? Lucy hesitated. Double my salary. A car. Health insurance. For my family. Andrew exhaled sharply, pacing the room. Typical gardener. He'll weaponize anything to get under my skin. Caroline touched Lucy's arm. You're not alone in this. We'll protect you. Lucy nodded, though fear lingered in her chest. The temptation was real. She wanted to believe loyalty and gratitude were enough, but the pull of family obligation was relentless. That night, Andrew sat awake in his study, staring at the city skyline in the distance. For years, he had defined his worth by outmaneuvering men like Ethan. But this was different. This wasn't about a merger or a stock. This was about Lucy and Mason's fragile hope. And he would not lose either. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Ethan invited Andrew to a private lunch at an upscale Manhattan club, the kind where mahogany walls muffled secrets and waiters moved like shadows. Andrew arrived knowing exactly what game was being played. Ethan, with his perfectly trimmed silver hair and calculating smile, leaned back in his chair as if presiding over a chessboard. You've done well with Mason, Ethan said smoothly, slicing into his steak. Impressive progress, given the circumstances. Andrew's jaw tightened. Spare me the pleasantries. You want Lucy. Ethan smirked. She's talented. Wasted as a housekeeper. With my resources, she could change lives. She's already changing one, Andrew snapped. Ethan dabbed his lips with a napkin. Everyone has a price, Harris. You of all people should know that. Andrew leaned forward, voice low and sharp. Not this time. Lucy isn't for sale. And if you think you can manipulate her, think again. She's part of my family now. For a flicker of a moment, Ethan's composure cracked, irritation flashing in his eyes. Then he smiled coldly. Family, you say? Be careful, Andrew. Loyalty is fragile. When her brother's needs outweigh your promises, she may walk away. Andrew left the club with fury simmering in his veins. For once, the battlefield wasn't measured in dollars, but in trust. Back in Greenwich, Mason sensed the tension. That evening, after practice, he asked quietly, Dad, are we losing Lucy? Andrew knelt, gripping his son's small hands. No, we're not losing her. I won't let that happen. Lucy overheard from the doorway, her chest aching. The words both comforted and terrified her. She knew Andrew would fight, but the choice still sat heavy on her shoulders. That night, unable to sleep, Lucy walked through the quiet house. In the garden, the autumn leaves rustled in the wind, a reminder of time slipping forward. She thought of her brother's laugh, her mother's tired eyes, Mason's triumphant grin when he stood longer than the day before. The truth settled like a stone in her chest. Her heart was already tied to this family. Ethan's offer promised security, but Andrew and Mason offered meaning. The next morning, she entered Andrew's study, determination steadying her voice. Mr. Harris, I need to tell you something. I won't take Ethan's offer. My place is here. With Mason. With your family. But I need to ask for something in return. Not for me, for my mother and brother. Help me care for them, and I'll never doubt where I belong. Andrew rose slowly, meeting her gaze with rare vulnerability. Done. They'll have whatever they need. And you'll have my word. For the first time, Lucy smiled without reservation. The decision had been made. The loyalty secured. The game Ethan tried to play had only strengthened the bond within the Harris family. But as Andrew watched Mason take his first unassisted steps later that week, he realized something larger was at play. Lucy's gift, Mason's courage. Together they were shaping more than progress. They were planting the seed of an idea that would one day outgrow even the walls of their vast home. Spring sunlight spilled across the manicured lawn of the preschool in Greenwich, casting playful shadows of balloons tied along the fence. Parents gathered in clusters, their voices rising in anticipation, their phones ready to capture the milestone. The graduation ceremony was more than a rite of passage. It was a display of pride, of progress, of small victories celebrated as if they were great triumphs. Andrew stood beside Caroline in the crowd, dressed less like a mogul and more like a father. His suit jacket slung over one arm, his tie loosened. His eyes never left Mason, who sat among his classmates on the small stage, his purple crutches resting beside him. Lucy sat a few rows behind, hands folded, gaze steady, as though she were the anchor holding the boy's confidence in place. When Mason's name was called, he rose. A hush rippled through the audience as he set his crutches aside. For a moment, his small frame swayed with uncertainty. Then, with a deep breath, he began to walk, step by deliberate step, his arms stretched slightly for balance. The crowd gasped, then erupted into applause. Parents leaned forward, children cheered, and Caroline pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Andrew's chest tightened with an emotion so raw he could barely breathe. Mason crossed the stage. Not stumbling, not falling, walking. By the time he reached the teacher waiting with his certificate, his face shone with triumph. He turned to the crowd and lifted the paper high, his voice ringing with joy. "This is for my dad, my mom, and Lucy." Andrew's vision blurred. He didn't care that dozens of cameras caught the moment, that whispers spread among the wealthy families of Greenwich. He only knew that his son had claimed victory not just for himself, but for the people who had believed in him. When the ceremony ended, Andrew didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, pulling Mason into his arms, lifting him high. The boy laughed, breathless but strong. Caroline wrapped them both in an embrace, tears spilling freely. Then Andrew turned to the crowd. His voice carried across the murmurs, steady and resolute. "Lucy Alvarez is not just our helper. She is part of our family. And what you've seen today is proof of what happens when someone refuses to give up on a child. Remember her name." The declaration stunned the crowd. Some faces registered surprise, others respect. Sylvia, standing near the back, stiffened visibly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan Gardner, who had slipped into the event uninvited, observed with a calculating gaze, though even he could not mask the flicker of admiration. The whispers spread beyond the schoolyard. By evening, stories circulated through Greenwich, Stamford, and eventually Manhattan. Families whispered about the Harris boy who walked across the stage, about the woman who had guided him, about the billionaire who had spoken of loyalty and love rather than deals and dominance. That night, the Harris family sat in the garden where it had all begun. Mason curled between his parents, Lucy seated nearby. Fireflies blinked against the darkening sky, and for the first time in years, Andrew felt peace wash over him. Yet beneath that peace pulsed something new: possibility. If Lucy could transform Mason, what could she do for other children? If one family's story could ripple through a community, what could an entire center accomplish? The thought lodged in Andrew's mind, insistent, unshakable. He turned to Lucy, his voice quiet but certain. "We should think bigger. Not just for Mason. For every child like him." Lucy blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "A center," Andrew said. "Therapy. Hope. A place where kids can believe in themselves again. Where families don't feel alone." Caroline's hand tightened on his. "You're serious?" Andrew nodded. "Dead serious." The seed was planted, and with it, the path to the final battle against doubt, pride, and the past. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of planning. Andrew's assistants were baffled when their boss redirected resources not toward a new tech acquisition, but toward feasibility studies for a pediatric therapy center. He called architects, therapists, and financial analysts. For once, his boardroom skills were wielded not for profit, but for purpose. Caroline became his partner in vision, her social connections turning into leverage. Lucy, hesitant at first, found herself thrust into meetings, her first-hand knowledge of therapy exercises shaping decisions professionals hadn't considered. She was no longer just an employee, she was the heart of the project. Word spread quickly. Some praised Andrew's pivot as visionary. Others mocked it as a vanity project. Ethan Gardner was among the latter. At a charity gala, he cornered Andrew near the bar, glass of champagne in hand, his smile sharp as a blade. "You think you can turn sentiment into strategy?" Ethan sneered. "This isn't Wall Street. It's pity dressed as philanthropy." Andrew met his gaze calmly. "It's neither. It's investment. The most important one I've ever made." Ethan leaned closer. "Mark my words, Harris. This will fail. And when it does, Lucy will see you for what you are, a man playing savior." Andrew didn't flinch. "And when it succeeds, you'll see me for what I've become, a father." The confrontation reverberated long after. Ethan's words still stung, not because Andrew believed them, but because they reminded him of the fragility of this endeavor. Yet the work pressed forward. Mason, too, sensed the rising stakes. One evening, as Andrew tucked him into bed, the boy whispered, "Are you really building a place for kids like me?" "Yes," Andrew said softly. "So every child can feel what you feel now." Mason's eyes glistened. "Then I want to help. I can tell them it's possible." Andrew kissed his forehead. "You already have." The groundbreaking ceremony was modest, attended by local families and a handful of curious reporters. Andrew spoke briefly, his voice steady, his gaze often drifting toward Mason and Lucy. Caroline stood beside him, pride softening her features. But the true climax came later, at the official inauguration 2 years on. By then, the building was complete. Beacon Kids, Center for Pediatric Therapy. The halls echoed with laughter and determination. Lucy, now a certified therapist, walked through the doors not as staff, but as director of therapeutic programs. Mason, at 6, ran freely across the lobby, his legs strong, his laughter unburdened. The ribbon was cut. The crowd applauded. And Andrew, standing on the steps with his family, felt the weight of transformation settle within him. He was no longer just a billionaire. He was a man who had chosen love over profit, purpose over power. As the applause roared, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Ethan Gardner. For a moment, Andrew considered ignoring it. Then, curiosity won. "Harris," Ethan's voice came through, subdued, almost hesitant. "I was wrong. My grandson, he's here. And he's smiling for the first time in months. Whatever you've built, it works. I owe you an apology." Andrew closed his eyes briefly, letting the words sink in. Apology accepted. When he hung up, he turned to see Mason sprinting toward him, Lucy close behind, Caroline laughing with tears in her eyes. The center had just opened, but its first victory was already won. The late summer sun slanted low across the Harris estate, bathing the garden in golden light. The same garden that had once witnessed Mason's trembling first attempts to balance on his purple crutches now echoed with the sound of his unburdened footsteps. At 6 years old, he darted across the grass with an ease that still astonished his parents. His blonde hair gleamed, his laughter carried, and his legs, once so uncertain, moved with confidence that had been earned, not gifted. Andrew sat on the terrace steps, watching. No boardroom, no skyscraper could compare to this sight. Caroline was beside him, her arm loosely draped over his shoulder, her gaze soft. Lucy knelt a few yards away, encouraging a younger child from the therapy center who had come to visit, her voice gentle but firm. The Beacon Kids Center had become more than an idea. It was a living, breathing reality. And tonight, in the garden where it all began, the family had chosen to celebrate quietly, away from cameras, reporters, and socialites. The inauguration had been triumphant, filled with speeches, applause, and even a reluctant congratulations from Ethan Gardner. But here, there was no performance, only truth. Mason came racing back, panting, cheeks flushed. He collapsed dramatically against his father's chest. "Caught you, Dad," he declared between breaths. Andrew laughed, scooping him up effortlessly. "You're getting too fast for me." Caroline reached over, tickling Mason's side until he squealed. Lucy smiled as she watched, though she tried to focus on the other child still practicing steps nearby. For a moment, she remembered the night Ethan had cornered her, the card heavy in her pocket, the temptation sharp. If she had chosen differently, this moment would not exist. She had stayed, and because she had, Mason's laughter now filled the air. Andrew looked over at her, their eyes meeting. Gratitude passed silently between them. He had once viewed loyalty as a transaction, measured in contracts and bonuses. But Lucy had taught him loyalty born of faith, of shared struggle, of love that defied titles. "Do you remember?" Andrew asked quietly, addressing Mason. "The first day I saw you standing here? You spilled juice, and Lucy was cleaning it up. You were smiling. That was the first time I realized. I'd been missing everything." Mason tilted his head, curious. "You didn't miss it, Dad. You just came late." Andrew's throat tightened. Out of the mouths of children came truths sharper than any adult dared speak. "Late," he murmured, "but I made it." Caroline leaned her head against his shoulder. "And you stayed." The evening deepened. Fireflies flickered among the hedges, their glow weaving between laughter and soft conversation. Lucy guided the visiting child back toward the house, praising his effort, promising he'd walk more tomorrow. She had grown into her role not as a helper, not as an employee, but as a healer, a leader, and, though unspoken, as part of this family. Andrew rose, lifting Mason onto his shoulders. The boy giggled, reaching for the fading streaks of pink in the sky. Caroline walked at his side, her hand brushing his. Lucy trailed a step behind, carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew her place in the world had been earned, not granted. As they reached the garden's center, Andrew stopped. The memory of that night 2 years earlier surfaced vividly. The shock of walking through the door before 9, of seeing Lucy on her knees cleaning juice, Mason standing proudly, smiling, as if defying fate. That single, ordinary moment had split his life in two, before and after. He lowered Mason to the grass, his voice steady. This is where everything changed. Not the office, not the city. Here. Mason looked up at him, solemn despite his youth. And it's where I learned to walk. Andrew smiled. And where I learned to live. Caroline's eyes shimmered. She reached for Lucy's hand, pulling her gently into the circle. For a long moment, the four of them stood together, no titles, no divisions. Just family. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. Shadows lengthened across the garden, and with them came a profound stillness. Andrew felt it settle inside him. The realization that his greatest investment had not been in markets or technology, but in time, in love, in purpose. As the first stars pricked the horizon, Mason wrapped his arms around Andrew's waist. Caroline leaned close, and Lucy remained steady beside them. They stood as one, their silhouettes bathed in the last light of day, bound not by circumstance but by choice. And in that golden hour, Andrew Harris understood fully what he had once overlooked. Wealth was fleeting, power fragile, but love was the only legacy worth leaving. If you made it this far, leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from today and what you thought of the story. If you can, share this video with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to receive new videos. A big hug, and see you tomorrow.